Imagine a night 4,000 years ago in Egypt. The desert air is cooling, the sky awash with stars, and in a dimly lit workshop, a crucible glows. Inside is not metal, not clay, but something stranger, a slurry of crushed quartz pebbles mixed with ash. The workers are trying to coax color from sand. When they succeed, they don't produce gold or silver. Instead, they pour out a lump of hardened fire. Blue as lapis, green as emerald, brittle but luminous. This is glass at its beginning, not transparent windows, not delicate goblets, but small beads and inlays. Archaeologists have found such pieces in Mesopotamia and Egypt dating back to around 2000 BCE. In Amarna, the short-lived capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, entire workshops have been excavated. Crucibles stained cobalt blue still bear traces of molten glass. Rods of half-finished frit, essentially glass baked halfway and ready to be remelted, were stacked like bread. This wasn't an accident by a campfire. It was planned, industrial, controlled. And yet, when people in later centuries tried to explain glass, they preferred stories to archaeology. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, tells a tale in his Natural History. Phoenician sailors, he says, cooking on the beach, ran out of stones to prop their pots. They used blocks of natron instead, a mineral rich in soda. The fire melted the natron into the sand, and glass flowed out. It's a beautiful story. You can picture the flickering firelight, the sudden shimmer of molten glass. But it's wrong. Glass was already old by Pliny's day, and its origins lie not in accident, but in centuries of craft. Still, his myth stuck, because it felt true. When faced with a material so strange, people reached for wonder. The real story is slower, and in some ways more impressive. Early glassmakers were already masters of fire. They smelted copper, glazed ceramics, baked bricks. Glass was the next step. Not stumbled upon, but teased out through experiment. Assyrian tablets from the 7th century BCE give recipes in cuneiform. Take 60 parts sand, 180 parts ash from marine plants, 5 parts copper oxide. These weren't myths, they were instructions. The results were small, heavy, and rare. Core-formed vessels, where a clay dung core was dipped in molten glass and scraped out later, were thick-walled, often striped with spirals of blue, yellow, and white. Glass imitated gemstones like lapis lazuli or turquoise, stones that had to be imported at great expense from Afghanistan or Sinai. For elites, glass was a substitute jewel, a way of holding color itself. It's worth pausing here. For centuries, glass wasn't transparent. It wasn't windows, mirrors, or lenses. It was color. Opaque, vivid, almost magical. A ritual material, a luxury, a status symbol. But already, the essentials were in place. Sand, soda, lime, and fire. What they lacked was the breakthrough that would make glass light, thin, and abundant. For now, it was still heavy, precious, close to stone. The ancients marveled at it. They set glass beads in jewelry, placed colored inlays in tombs, and carried tiny perfume bottles along trade routes. Yet the technology remained limited. Casting was slow, cores were fragile, walls were thick. Glass remained rare, an elite adornment rather than a common vessel. That would change in the 1st century before the Common Era. Somewhere in Roman Syria, a craftsman put his lips to a hollow tube and blew. The lump of molten glass swelled into a bubble, and the story of glass shifted forever. The secret was breath. Somewhere around the 1st century, BCE, in the Levant, workshops in Sidon and Jerusalem are often named. Artisans discovered that a hollow iron pipe could be more than a tool. Dip it into molten glass, lift out a glowing gather, and blow. The lump swelled like a soap bubble, shimmering, alive. Turn the pipe, puff again, and the bubble elongated. Pinch, twist, snip, and in a matter of minutes, a vessel was born. Pliny the Elder, writing a century later in his Natural History, marveled at it. Glass, he said, is molded by breath. The phrase is simple, but revolutionary. For the first time, the human lung itself was part of the workshop. The consequences were immediate. Before the blowpipe, glass had been elite ornament, small core-formed bottles, thick, striped, costly. After the blowpipe, glass could be produced quickly, cheaply, in endless shapes. The economics flipped. What had been rare became abundant. We know this not from texts alone, but from ash. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it froze Roman life mid-motion. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, archaeologists have opened cupboards filled with glass, cups, bowls, flasks, bottles. Not one or two treasures, but shelves stacked high. This was no longer a material for kings. Ordinary Romans dined and drank from glass. Roman glassmakers were not content with speed. They experimented. They blew bubbles into clay or metal molds, embossing patterns directly onto the vessel. They cut and engraved surfaces, creating designs that caught the light. And sometimes, their craft reached marvels we still struggle to explain. The Lycurgus cup, now in the British Museum, looks green when lit from the front, but glows red when light shines through it. For centuries, its trick was a mystery. Modern analysis shows why. Tiny particles of gold and silver, suspended in the glass, scatter light in different ways. Today, we call this nanotechnology. To a 4th century Roman, it was magic in a cup. Other masterpieces include the cage cups, vessels so thinly blown that their outer surface was cut away into a lattice, leaving a delicate cage around the inner cup. To hold one is to hold breath solidified into lace. But glass was not only for marvels. It entered daily life. Romans began fitting windows with crude panes. These were not the flawless sheets we know today. They were bubbly, wavy, full of imperfections, but they allowed light to enter while keeping out wind and rain. For the first time, daylight itself could be controlled, filtered, made domestic. The symbolism was profound. Light, once an uncontrollable force, could now be invited inside at human will. A Roman house with a window pane was more than comfortable. It was modern. By the 2nd century CE, glass workshops dotted the empire, from Spain to Syria, Britain to North Africa. Each region developed its own style, but everywhere the essentials were the same. Furnace, blowpipe, breath. Archaeologists have found molds stamped with names, suggesting branded workshops. Glass had become not just craft, but commerce. And yet, the democratization of glass did not erase its glamour. Wealthy Romans still commissioned ornate pieces, cut crystal, elaborate tableware, colored mosaics. Glass could be both ordinary and extraordinary, kitchenware and treasure, common and elite. Then, as Rome fractured, so too did its glass. Trade routes faltered, workshops closed, skills scattered. Glass never vanished. It survived in Byzantine and Islamic hands, but the ubiquity of Roman glass faded in the West. What had once filled cupboards and windows became, again, rare. Still, the revolution of the blowpipe could not be undone. From the moment breath entered the furnace, glass was destined to be a material not of elites alone, but of humanity itself. When Rome collapsed, its furnaces dimmed. But glass did not vanish. In the Byzantine world, mosaic makers set tesserae into domes that glittered like stars. In Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, Islamic artisans enameled glass lamps with Quranic inscriptions. Along caravan routes, traders carried soda ash from the Levant and cobalt from Persia. The knowledge survived, but in Western Europe it flickered low. Then, in the late 13th century, Venice seized it. Venice was a city born of trade and risk. Its wealth came from the Adriatic and beyond. Silks from China, spices from India, and crucially, the raw ingredients for glass: soda ash, lime, sand. But the furnaces that transformed them into brilliance were dangerous. The city was wooden, its alleys narrow, and fire could sweep through in hours. So in 1291, the Venetian Senate issued a decree. All glass furnaces must be moved out of the city proper and onto the island of Murano. At first, this was practical: protect Venice from fire. But it created something else: a republic within a republic. Murano became a walled garden of fire, where every master, every apprentice, every secret was confined. The glassblowers of Murano lived in paradox. On one hand, they were prisoners. State laws forbade them to leave the island without permission. Those who tried risked confiscation of property, sometimes even threats of death. The Republic knew their value. Venetian glass was not just craft, it was monopoly, diplomacy, revenue. But with captivity came privilege. Glassblowers were granted special status. Their daughters could marry into the Venetian nobility, almost unthinkable in that rigid society. They were artisans, yes, but artisans treated like strategic assets, halfway between craftsmen and diplomats. Inside this crucible, innovation flourished. Murano glassmakers invented cristallo, a perfectly clear, colorless glass, so pure it was said to rival natural crystal. They fused rods of color into millefiori, 1,000 flowers. They mastered enameling, gilding, and engraving. Their chandeliers spread across Europe, delicate arms of glass that looked like lace frozen in flame. Most transformative of all were mirrors. For centuries, Europeans had relied on polished bronze or silver, which gave dim, warped reflections. On Murano, craftsmen learned to coat the back of glass with a mercury tin amalgam. The result was shocking. A mirror that reflected cleanly, brightly, faithfully. To see oneself clearly, for the first time in history, was to encounter a new intimacy. Venetian mirrors became objects of obsession. Kings and queens paid staggering sums. In 1615, a single mirror could cost as much as a warship. They lined the chambers of nobles, multiplying candlelight into dazzling halls. At Versailles, the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors, became the theater of Louis XIV's power, each reflection an echo of his infinity. But monopoly invites envy. In the 17th century, France's finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert decided to break Venice's hold. He founded the Manufacture Royale des Glaces at Saint-Gobain, a glassworks designed to rival Murano. To staff it, he bribed Venetian craftsmen, offering wealth and protection. Some accepted. Venice was furious. The Council of Ten, its feared security body, debated retaliation. Surviving records mention punishments, beyond exile, for defectors. Rumors spread that assassins stalked the streets of Paris. Whether knives were truly drawn is unclear, but the fear was real. Glass had become state security. Despite Venetian threats, secrets seeped out. Bohemian glassmakers in Central Europe began producing brilliant cut crystal. In England, George Ravenscroft added lead oxide to glass in the 1670s, creating lead crystal that was brighter and easier to cut. By the 18th century, Murano's monopoly was broken. But for centuries, Murano had been the beating heart of European glass. Its furnaces glowed behind guarded doors, its masters bound by law, its chandeliers and mirrors filling palaces and cathedrals. Even today, when tourists walk Murano's canals, they are walking the streets of an island that was once a laboratory of state secrets. For the glassblowers, it was a strange inheritance, bound and privileged, celebrated and constrained. Their breath fed furnaces whose light reached Versailles. Their hands shaped mirrors that redefined how Europe saw itself. The island of secrets ensured that glass was no longer only a Roman legacy. It was Venetian, luxurious, guarded, and global. The next revolution in glass didn't glitter in palaces or dangle from ceilings. It perched modestly on the bridge of the nose. In late 13th century Italy, craftsmen learned to grind small convex lenses. No one knows exactly who first set them into frames, but by 1306, we have testimony. In Florence, the Dominican friar Giordano da Pisa preached about the art of making eyeglasses, recently invented for the aid of old men whose sight has failed. He said the invention was less than 20 years old. A fresco painted in Treviso in 1352 shows Cardinal Hugh of Saint-Cher with spectacles balanced on his nose, bent over a manuscript. It was a modest tool, but transformative. Monks, scribes, and scholars whose eyes would once have failed in middle age could now keep reading, writing, copying for decades longer. In an age when literacy was rare and precious, spectacles effectively increased the pool of working intellectuals. The long arc of learning bent quietly through glass. Centuries later, that same principle, glass-bending light, would remake the universe. In 1609, Galileo Galilei heard of a Dutch spyglass that brought distant objects near. He built his own, refining it with the help of Venetian glass grinders. His best instruments magnified 30 times. Crude by today's standards, but revolutionary. The following year, he rushed his findings into print. In Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, he announced discoveries that shattered the old cosmos. He wrote of 4 planets, never seen from the beginning of the world up to our own time, orbiting Jupiter. He sketched the rough surface of the moon, pocked with mountains and craters. He traced the phases of Venus, evidence that it circled the sun. At the same time, he wrote to Belisario Vinta, Secretary of State to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Galileo proposed naming the moons the Medicean stars, in honor of his patrons. Here was the duality of glass: revelation and politics, evidence and ambition carried together through a lens. The Inquisition would later deny his conclusions, but they could not deny what the glass showed. Once people had seen mountains on the moon, the perfect spheres of Aristotle could never be believed again. If telescopes expanded the heavens, microscopes collapsed the world into invisible depths. In the 1670s, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch draper with no university training, began grinding tiny lenses. His microscopes were simple, brass plates, each holding a glass bead smaller than a grain of rice. Yet under them, he could magnify 200 times. In 1674, he wrote to the Royal Society of London, "I have observed certain small animal cules, very prettily a-moving." Later, examining plaques scraped from his own teeth, he reported, "An unbelievable, great company of living animalcules, a-swimming more nimbly than any I had ever seen before." Through his glass, Leeuwenhoek revealed bacteria, sperm cells, blood corpuscles, life forms no philosopher had imagined. In a single drop of saliva, he found a cosmos. The astonishment was mutual. The Royal Society at first doubted him, then sent emissaries to verify. What they saw through his lenses changed biology forever. The microscope opened a world within, just as the telescope had opened the world beyond. From spectacles in Treviso to Galileo's telescope in Padua, from Leeuwenhoek's microscopes in Delft to the laboratories of London and Paris, glass reshaped how humans perceived reality. It lengthened the lives of readers, expanded the universe, and revealed the hidden kingdoms of life. And all of it depended not only on genius, but on craft. The anonymous artisans grinding lenses in Venice, the unknown hands that blew Leeuwenhoek's tiny beads, the workshops that supplied glass clear enough to magnify truth. Glass had become more than material. It was vision itself. By the 18th century, glass had slipped from palaces and observatories into the very heart of science. Walk into a chemistry laboratory of the Enlightenment, and you would hear not only pens scratching or arguments rising, but the hiss of flame under glass. Benches crowded with flasks, retorts, alembics, jars sealed with wax and cork, all transparent, all fragile, all essential. The reason was simple. Science required not only results, but proof. Proof had to be seen. Metals would corrode, clay would crack, but glass was transparent. It let reactions display themselves. Credibility itself was made of glass. Take Joseph Priestley in 1774. Working in a modest lab in Wiltshire, he heated red mercuric oxide in a glass vessel and collected the gas that escaped. A candle burned brighter in it. Mice lived longer. Priestley called it dephlogisticated air. He didn't yet know what it was, but he had captured oxygen. Soon after, in Paris, Antoine Lavoisier repeated and refined Priestley's work. Using sealed glass flasks and precise balances, he proved that combustion was not the release of phlogiston, a mysterious, invisible substance then believed to explain fire, but a reaction with oxygen. In 1789, in his Traité élémentaire de chimie, he gave the gas its name. The old theory of phlogiston collapsed, and modern chemistry was born. Both discoveries depended on glass. Without transparent flasks, no one could see a gas produced, measure it, or repeat the result. The vessels mattered as much as the experiments. And glass kept pace as science advanced. In the late 19th century, Otto Schott, a German chemist in Jena, experimented with formulas. By adding boron to silica, he created a new glass that could withstand sudden changes in heat. Ordinary glass shatters if heated and cooled quickly. Schott's borosilicate did not. In 1915, Corning introduced it commercially as Pyrex. In laboratories, Pyrex became indispensable. Chemists could boil, freeze, reheat, and trust their vessels to hold. In biology, glass slides carried tissue under microscopes. Petri dishes held colonies of bacteria. In physics, vacuum tubes, fragile, glowing, powered the first radios and computers. Even the colors of glass became science. Medieval artisans had stumbled into them by accident. Cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold nanoparticles for red. By the 19th century, chemists understood the reactions, using them to study the physics of light itself. A stained glass window was not just beauty, it was spectroscopy in disguise. Think about what this means. The credibility of modern science, its very claim to truth, has always been made through glass. Without transparency, no one would believe. Without stability, no one would repeat. Priestley's jar, Lavoisier's flasks, Schott's borosilicate, Corning's Pyrex, each was as essential to discovery as the ideas themselves. It is easy to overlook because laboratory glass is plain, stripped of ornament. But in that plainness lies its power. A beaker does not impress with beauty. It persuades with clarity. To see a reaction bubble in a flask is to believe it. To repeat it in the same vessel is to prove it. Glass, once a jewel for kings, had become the architecture of knowledge. By the 19th century, glass had left the guarded workshops of Murano and the tidy benches of chemists. The new question wasn't whether glass could astonish or persuade, but whether it could be produced in staggering volume, for factories, for households, for empires. One symbol announced this shift to the world, the Crystal Palace of 1851. Designed by Joseph Paxton for London's Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace was not stone, but iron and glass, nearly 1,000 feet long, with over 300,000 panes. To Victorians, it looked like a cathedral of industry. Sunlight flooded through its walls, illuminating machines, textiles, inventions from across the globe. The building itself was the star exhibit, proof that glass had become cheap and plentiful enough to roof an empire. Newspapers marveled that it was built in just 9 months, made possible by standardized sheets from the Chance Brothers Glassworks in Birmingham. Glass was no longer a jewel, it was structure. Industry also transformed the bottle. For centuries, even factory bottles were blown by hand, one by one. In 1903, in Toledo, Ohio, Michael Joseph Owens patented an automatic bottle machine. Where a skilled blower might produce 2 bottles in a minute, Owens's machine made 20. By 1917, his machines were turning out millions annually. Beer, soda, medicine, all poured into uniform containers. The effect was double-edged. Bottled goods became cheaper, safer, more widely available. But skilled blowers, once respected craftsmen, saw their trade collapse. The furnace that had once elevated them now displaced them. Glass was no longer the work of artisans. It was industry. Flat glass, too, faced a revolution. For centuries, making a sheet required casting molten glass onto a table and grinding it smooth. Wasteful, slow, costly. In 1959, Alistair Pilkington and Kenneth Bickerstaff in St. Helens, England, introduced the float glass process. Molten glass poured onto molten tin, spreading into flawless sheets, smooth on both sides. It was elegant in its simplicity, and unstoppable. Within decades, float glass was universal. Nearly every window in every skyscraper, every windshield, every storefront today comes from that process. Architecture changed with it. Skyscrapers, once clad in stone, could now be sheathed in glass. Curtain walls rose in New York, Chicago, Hong Kong, cities reflecting themselves in mirror towers. Modernism preached transparency. Less is more, said Mies van der Rohe, as he designed buildings of steel and glass. Transparency became style, power, ideology. But the story of industrial glass was not confined to Europe and America. Glass traveled with empire. Traders carried beads along the African coast, exchanging them for ivory, gold, even enslaved people. In West Africa, Venetian and Dutch beads became currency, objects of beauty and of violence. Archaeologists still unearth caches of them in Ghana and Nigeria, reminders of how glass was woven into global trade, sometimes as treasure, sometimes as tool of exploitation. By the mid-20th century, glass was everywhere. Bottles on every table, windows in every home, towers shimmering in every city. What had once been luxury had become infrastructure. What had once been secret had become commodity. And yet, in the very act of becoming common, glass had never lost its power to shape how people lived, to define what they drank from, what they lived inside, what they saw when they looked up at the skyline. Glass was no longer a marvel. It was the mass material of modern life. By the mid-20th century, glass was everywhere you could see. Bottles on the table, windows in the home, towers on the skyline. But its next transformation was quieter. It moved from visible walls and panes into invisible networks, carrying voices, images, and power across the globe. The turning point came in 1966, when Charles Cow and George Hockham, researchers in England, published a technical paper that few outside the field noticed. They showed that if glass fibers could be purified enough, they could carry light signals for kilometers with almost no loss. Cow calculated the threshold. Impurities had to be reduced to 1 part in a billion. It seemed impossible. But by the 1970s, industry caught up. The result was fiber optics. Strands of glass thinner than a human hair, drawn with precision, that could bend light and guide it through total internal reflection. At first, they carried signals between laboratories, then across cities. By the 1980s, under oceans. Today, hundreds of thousands of kilometers of fiber lie on the seabed, carrying nearly all international internet traffic. Every email, every video call, every stream of data races through glass. For this work, Cow received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2009. But the real monument to his insight isn't a medal. It's the global nervous system of glass under our feet and under the sea. Glass also turned skyward. In 1990, NASA launched the Hubble Space Telescope. Its primary mirror, 2.4 meters wide, was made of ultra-low expansion glass. But it had been ground incorrectly. The flaw was tiny, just 2.2 microns, 1/50th the width of a human hair. Yet it blurred every image. Newspapers called it a catastrophe. The fix, in 1993, was itself a parable of glass. Astronauts installed corrective optics, effectively glasses for a telescope. When the first sharp images returned, galaxies spiraling, nebulae glowing, the world gasped. It was proof that even in the heavens, vision depended on glass. Hubble was not the end. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, left glass behind, replacing it with beryllium-coated mirrors. But even that choice testifies to how long glass defined the frontier of astronomy, from Galileo's lenses to Hubble's eye in orbit. Meanwhile, glass transformed daily life at ground level. In the early 2000s, Corning developed Gorilla Glass, a chemically strengthened aluminosilicate. By bathing glass in molten potassium salt, larger potassium ions replaced smaller sodium ions in the surface, creating compression that made it resistant to scratches and cracks. In 2007, the first iPhone launched, with Gorilla Glass on its screen. Within a decade, billions of people were swiping across glass every day. We touch it more often than wood, stone, or metal. It has become the skin of the digital world. And glass turned to power itself. Solar panels, the quiet engines of renewable energy, rely on sheets of glass to protect silicon cells while letting in light. Each panel is, in essence, a small marriage of light and glass, turning photons into current. So much of modern life flows through invisible glass, the cables beneath oceans, the screens in our pockets, the panels on our roofs, the telescope's eye above the atmosphere. Glass is no longer just what we look at. It is what we look through, and what carries our voices, our images, our energy, unseen. Glass has always been more than material. Long before it filled skyscrapers or cables, it carried meanings of fragility, of vision, of transcendence. Its history is also a history of symbols. Step into Chartres Cathedral in France. Sunlight filters through stained glass, falling in blues so deep they seem to contain the sky itself. Each panel tells a story, prophets, saints, parables, painted not with ink, but with light. For medieval congregations who could not read, stained glass was scripture in color. Theophilus Presbyter, a 12th century monk who wrote one of the earliest treatises on crafts, described how artisans painted and fired glass, calling it a form of silent preaching. They teach the ignorant by means of pictures. In Paris, at Sainte-Chapelle, entire walls were built of glass, 60 feet high, flooding the space with crimson and sapphire. Standing inside, one feels less in a building than inside a jewel box. Here, glass was not a window to the outside, but a veil that replaced the outside altogether. In Islam, glass carried scripture literally. Mamluk mosque lamps of the 14th century, enameled and gilded, bore Quranic inscriptions, including the famous verse from Surah Al-Nur, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Flame burned inside text, text inside glass. Light became theology. Later, mirrors changed how Europeans thought about themselves. Before Murano's mercury-backed glass, most people had never seen a sharp reflection. Bronze and silver gave shadows, not faces. Suddenly, courtiers and merchants confronted themselves with startling clarity. At Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors multiplied Louis XIV into infinity. Visitors were dazzled not just by the king, but by their own image in endless replication. Some historians argue that widespread mirrors shifted European consciousness, deepening individuality, vanity, and self-awareness. Folklore and science both took glass into their imagination. Cinderella's slipper, famously described as glass in Charles Perrault's 1697 tale, became a symbol of transformation through fragility. Some scholars argue it may have been a mistranslation of verre, meaning fur, but glass endured in the popular mind. At the same time, natural philosophers in the 17th century marveled at Prince Rupert's drops, teardrops of molten glass quenched in water. Strike the bulbous head with a hammer, and it withstands the blow. Snap the thin tail, and the entire drop shatters explosively into dust. Fragility and resilience fused in a single form. Demonstrations were performed before monarchs to show the paradox of glass. Indestructible and yet undone by the smallest flaw. Language absorbed these properties. We speak of the glass ceiling that blocks advancement, of living in glass houses where privacy is impossible, of governments promising transparency. Glass became metaphor for barriers seen and unseen, for clarity and exposure, for strength always on the edge of shattering. And glass remained ritual. Across cultures, we raise glasses to toast, clink them together as if to make visible the bonds of community. In kitchens, Pyrex dishes hold family meals. In medicine, glass vials and syringes carry vaccines and cures. In the digital age, we swipe our fingers across glass screens hundreds of times a day. Each touch a gesture of connection, commerce, or memory. Literature, too, could not resist. St. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians, "For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face," became one of the most enduring metaphors of human limitation. Jorge Luis Borges, in his story The Aleph, imagined a point in space where all things are visible at once, and likened it to a crystal sphere. Writers, theologians, poets, all reached for glass when they sought to express vision and its limits. From beads in Mesopotamia to fiber optics under oceans, from stained glass in cathedrals to gorilla glass in smartphones, the story of glass is a story of human attempts to shape light, to hold it, bend it, magnify it, and see through it. Most of the hands who made this possible are anonymous. The bead maker at Amarna, the Roman blower in Pompeii, the Venetian confined to Murano, the apprentice polishing lenses for Galileo, the technician tending a float line in St. Helens, the engineer drawing fiber thinner than a hair. Their names are lost, but their breath, their labor, their fire remain with us. Glass is not eternal. It can shatter in an instant, and yet, in another sense, it endures across millennia. It is fragile and strong, transparent and opaque, ordinary and miraculous. So the next time you lift a cup, glance in a mirror, step into a glass tower, or swipe your finger across a screen, remember, you are touching a story 4,000 years long. From The Glassblowers.